Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Annie Wilson. I am very proud to be the programming supervisor for the FirstOntario Performing Arts Centre, and I'm here to welcome you today to our panel discussion. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that the FirstOntario Performing Arts Centre and the Marilyn I. Walker School of Fine and Performing Arts, which are both located in downtown St. Catharines, are on the shared traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and many other Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are sincerely grateful and respect the original caretakers of this land and the ones that are continuing to steward this land. And as this discussion will continue to illuminate, a reminder that we are all stewards of this land and of each other. We also acknowledge that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and 2S LGBTQAI+ peoples have been marginalized for centuries and more, and it is our collective responsibility to take action for a better world that is free from oppression, discrimination, and racism. The Performing Arts Centre and the School of Fine and Performing Arts are actively working to bring our community together through the arts in a place of mutual understanding, empathy, and respect. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here with you this afternoon to welcome you to Land, Water, Activism, Performance, a talkback discussion panel that features Kevin Matthew Wong of Broadleaf Theatre, Santee Smith of Kaha Dance Theatre, and dramatic arts professors David Fancy and Karen Fricker. The panel is part of a weekend program that we've developed in partnership with the School of Fine and Performing Arts that explores the intersection between climate change, performing arts, and activism. The PAC has greatly valued our opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues from the school on bringing this weekend together. And I will now welcome Karen Fricker to moderate this discussion. Karen is a professor that teaches courses in theater theory, history, and criticism in the Department of Dramatic Arts at the School of Fine and Performing Arts at Brock. She's also a theater critic for the Toronto Star and the vice president of the Canadian Theatre Critics Association, and a fantastic human being. So I'm happy to welcome Karen Fricker. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie, for that lovely introduction. And it is indeed great to be here. This is the first time I'm doing an event through StreamYard, so this is all very exciting. And I understand that the audience out there are receiving this through a number of social media platforms. So it's just great to be able to gather to talk about these important and pressing topics as and how we can. So our three panelists come from diverse backgrounds, professional experience, and disciplines, and are united by their interest in the convergence of performance and the climate crisis. We're gathering to hear about their individual work and also to discuss the convergence of their interests. And this is a conversation that we very much would like to involve you, the audience. So please, if at any point you've got a question or a comment, please use the comment function on the platform on which you are, and we will be able to see them through our comment section, and Annie is also going to be popping some of them on the screen as they come up. So as Annie has noted, this is we're on the final day of a really rich weekend of events, discussions, performances around the topic of theater and in the era of climate crisis. So we're talking about a global emergency, which is climate crisis, within the nested context of other global emergencies, the COVID-19 pandemic and the protests this summer against police brutality and anti-Black violence that have turned into a global anti-racist uprising. This in turn is within the context of Indigenous resurgence on Turtle Island and around the world, a response to the effects of colonization on human and non-human animals, on the land and all the beings and entities that exist on and in it and above it. All of these contexts, these complex contexts, inform the work of the panel speakers, and I'm looking forward to exploring those connections in this discussion. So now I am going to introduce our panelists. Kevin Matthew Wong, as mentioned, is Artistic Director of Broadleaf Theatre and a producer at Why Not Theatre in Toronto. He is the co-creator of the Chemical Valley Project, which has played at the FirstOntario Performing Arts Centre this weekend. Santee Smith is the founding and managing artistic director of Kaha Dance Theatre and the chancellor of McMaster University. And I just love to say that Santee Smith is the chancellor of McMaster University. Her new production, Skana, will premiere as panelists have been hearing about just now, next summer outdoors. And I'm sure she's going to be able to tell us a little bit more about this upcoming project. David Fancy is professor and chair of dramatic arts at Brock University and a director and playwright. He is co-editor with Konrad Alexandrovitz of the book Theater Pedagogy in the Era of Climate Crisis, which is being published by Routledge next year. And David is organizing a symposium on the topic of theater training in climate crisis next March at Brock. So can I ask our panelists to magically join me? Amazing. There they are. I love it when that happens. What we've done is I prepared an individual question for each panelist, which I'm going to ask them to answer. And then I have a question, a kind of a generative question that I hope we all can discuss. And we'll move on from there. I have some more prepared questions for the panelists, but also we'll see how we go. And if stuff comes up through audience questions, we'll roll with that. And we are going to be here till 2 o'clock. So that's the format. So I will start, welcome everyone, by talking to Kevin, because you've given us a show which many of us have had the opportunity to watch and enjoy this weekend. Exciting to see live theater happening at the FirstOntario Performing Arts Centre, which was then delivered to us in our homes. So my question to you is, Vanessa and BZ Gray, the central figures in your production, they're real people. They're real life Anishinaabe water protectors who frequently are involved in public action and to protest resource extraction and to raise public awareness of the effects of resource extraction. The production to some extent is an amplification of their voices. What do you think that theater, live theater, or in this case, live digital theater, can add to their activism?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. Thanks for that question. I think to start, I think the piece started with trying to find different ways of seeing. I think the way that I was receiving Vanessa and BZ's activism was quite limited in just receiving quite sensationalist clickbait kind of titles on 3 protesters have shut down a pipeline, and without much context more than that. And I wanted to find out why somebody would risk their future to do such an action, and also offer more time, offer more context, offer a different tone to the conversation that I felt wasn't really there. And also realizing as Vanessa, BZ, and I were speaking for the first time that there is a dependence upon media to also amplify their message, but the way that their message is being amplified is not necessarily within their control. And so for us as theater creators, we wanted to find a different way of being in relationship with Vanessa and BZ, for which they really could dictate what was missing from the conversation. And so what you see in the show are moments, explicit moments where BZ says, okay, at this point, give the audience candy. At this point, 2 more wampum belts. And you see it right then. And it's about, I think it's about seeing them in a different way and not just seeing them through, the photos of them being locked up to a bike lock. It's about understanding their family history. It's about understanding all of the multiple layers of context that we were really yearning for. And I think that the live context really allows people to let their guard down a little bit, to literally sit with these topics for an hour. And hopefully we're giving folks enough space between these many, many topics that we touch upon in this show for them to place themselves into some of the questions that we're trying to wrestle with.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about the really kind of playful theatrical ways that you found to make BZ and Vanessa present, because they're not physically in the show, but I really enjoyed the inventiveness about how it really was as if they were there by the way that you found ways to represent them. So thanks for that, and we'll more on that soon. So Santee, a question to start out with you. Your upcoming production Skana imagines a future in which 2 Ganegahaga women, auntie and niece, go on the run from environmental menace and shelter in their ancestral lands and work on rebuilding community by listening to the earth. And when thinking about your upcoming production, I thought about your recent production, The Mush Hole, which won many Dora Awards, congratulations, and which is about, was set in the Mohawk Institute and is about, it honors the spirit of residential school survivors and those who were affected by the schools, and I read that you said about the show you wanted to close the door on historical amnesia. So having made a show that is so much about engaging with the past and with history and with memory and with what we do and don't remember, what then has compelled you to make a next show set in the future?
Mm-hmm. That is also a good question. Thank you. Well, I mean, the mush hole is not really past because many people are experiencing it, the repercussions and the intergenerational impacts. I'm actually a intergenerational survivor of the Mohawk Institute as well. So some of the reality of happened 142-year history of the Mohawk Institute is very relevant today and will be relevant in the future as people deal with the fallout from that and the ongoing sort of institutionalized racism and oppression. So that is very much present. So even though we're talking about sort of the history of that, part of that not having historical amnesia is showing the fact that it is impacting people today and people's ideas of what it is to be Indigenous in Canada and in that history. So Skana also with time references, we're all over the place. Although it's set in the future, part of what we're doing is looking back at how we lived in balance with the land as our ancestor did in our Indigenous our Mohawk homelands. So time becomes very fluid as it is in our concept of time as well, that past, present, future are all very flexible. And also the idea that when we think about everything that we do, we're from our work to our purpose, that we're always thinking about the next 7 generations forward. So what we do today impacts the next 7 generations. And so that idea of looking forward is not an unusual concept for many Indigenous people.
And I realized as I've listened to your answer, my question, that my question was very much premised through a Western conception of time, right? That there's things that happen in the past, and then there's the present, and then there's the future, which is even within a Western framework, very flawed, because of course we are living in the present with the effects of the past and in anticipation of the future. And as you, Santee, can I ask you a follow-up question? As you have grappled with this very ever-changing present, how is that affecting how you're thinking about delivering the show next year? You mentioned to us briefly about doing it outside. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and it's everything is falling into place in a really great way. So unfortunately, we were supposed to premiere the work at FirstOntario Performing Arts, St. Catharines, in February. And that's been postponed because of the pandemic. And so we decided to premiere the show in July 2021 at a park, to be confirmed, in St. Catharines. And it'll be more of an immersive, interactive, multimedia performance, which really falls in line with our concept and the themes that we're bringing is actually working with the land. So all of our creation process has been land-based, traveling to our traditional homelands in upper state New York, and everything that we were doing, and we did a residency at Banff. So there's this really interesting mix between digital technology, new technology, track motion censoring, working with some high-tech programming, but then the actual physicality, we are making props from the land. We're using the land. We're being informed as much as we can by our surroundings and the sites that we work in. So that's been quite interesting. And so now we're forced to make the decision, if we want to do the show, well, let's do it outside. But it makes perfect sense for us to do that. And now all of the process that we've been going through will actually be manifested in the physical performance of it. So it's exciting. I'm really excited about it.
And I, in doing a little bit of research for this, I found a couple of fantastic, beautiful videos of you in the land dancing. I mean, there's one that I'm not sure if it's publicly available, but you in water covered in clay, and there's another one of you in the woods. And so it's making a lot of sense to me that it be performed outside, because what you've released thus far about the show is set in nature.
That's right.
So I'll ask the first question to David now. Thank you, David. You're very generous to let me read the co-written introduction to your upcoming volume to prep for this. And you mention the ecological philosopher Timothy Morton's concept of the ecological thought. Can you talk about what this is and how thinking in terms of the ecological thought might change approaches to theater training specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and lovely to be with everybody today. And special thanks to the Marilyn I. Walker Endowment to allow our part of this to happen on our end. I think there's probably a lot of different types of ecological thought. And just listening to you talk about the ecological thought from Morton, it sounds a little totalizing. But there are any number of different forms of conceptualization that emphasize connectivity, complex relationality, transversal arrangements of power sharing as opposed to supremacy, and organizations of power sharing that are hierarchical. And these modes of ecological thinking, and this has become clear working with collaborators from around the world in this volume that we're putting forward, come from many different types of thought traditions. Indigenous thought traditions, Western thinking traditions that seek to find their way outside of binarist modes of thought, of human, non-human being fundamentally separate, a whole range of different types of thinking. So one way we might proceed is to imagine what ecological thinking is not. And ecological thinking is not that which predicates distinct separations between nature and culture, between civilization and nature, by extension between man and woman, between white and non-white. These types of distinctions tend to establish binaries that organize themselves in hierarchies, and many forms of inclusion and, importantly, exclusion and minoritization result from that. So ecological thinking emphasizes complex relationality and connectivity that's not predicated on supremacy thinking.
And how then do you connect that to theater training?
This is a great question. It's been something I've been working on and thinking about for a long time with actors and theater projects that I've been involved with, where we use the other than human world or the inhuman within us, energies that aren't quite capturable or recognizable as being human. There are a lot of different ways, and what we've done at the end of our volume, rather than writing a conclusion, I sort of got together all the statements, wrote a manifesto, we made some tweaks to it, and all signed on to it. And in this kind of manifesto of environmental sustainability and change and addressing the theater, the climate crisis through theater pedagogy, we emphasize a lot of things. Engagement with other than human creatures in complex and interesting ways through affect, emotion, resonance. We look at biophilia, different forms of mimesis that get outside what can often happen in traditional Western theater practices of humans imitating other humans. We look at the ways in which community engagement that includes other than human members of the community as having agency, force, and beauty as being important. We look at the idea that the quote unquote environment and nature itself is continuously producing, with perhaps not as much self-consciousness and reflexivity as humans, but is continuously producing the artistic, continuously producing the beautiful. And so how do we as entities who understand ourselves as creating beautiful, critical pieces of work, accept that the rest of the other than human universe is also participating in co-creating that with us? So again, it's about lived practices of using corporeality, community engagement, conceptualization, practices of power sharing, to really investigate how we can avoid continuing to replicate anthropocentric dynamics that have usually tied into them patriarchal, racist, classist, ableist forms of thinking embedded within them.
Thanks, David. I saw Kevin and Santee taking notes. Looking forward to being able to read the really, from the sounds of the introduction, like really various chapters in this book, coming at things from all kinds of different angles around this question of the relationship between how we train today's theater artists, and how we are doing that in the context of climate crisis. I have a question for all three of you to just jump in however you'd like. This again is something I cribbed from David's introduction. Environment and sustainability scholar Kyle White argues that, quote, from an Indigenous and Indigenous Studies perspective, climate change is simply intensified colonialism. And I'm wondering if all of you can discuss this idea and its resonances for your work, the connection between colonization and climate change. And how do you, I'll go to you first, Kevin, because I see you nodding. And how do you connect climate change and colonialism in your work?
Yeah, this coming to that realization that they were connected was a big moment, I think, for our company, and it preceded actually getting started on this particular project. We hit a point for which we didn't know why our work felt so shallow in the context of Canada, but it did. We started out as a company that was trying to make work about climate, and then we hit a wall, and it did not make sense to be talking about climate in an abstract way. It felt so ungrounded and so unrelated to place. And it took connecting with artists like Debajamajig storytellers to understand more about how the history of this country is so deeply related to the way that we are encountering or not coming to terms with the climate crisis in this country. And whose voices are being heard in terms of who should lead the way on these conversations about how we should navigate the climate crisis. And yeah, so colonization and climate change, it's complicated too. I mean, one thing that we had to do in the show is to ask why I was the one on stage talking about this story as well. And one moment that was really important in the process of putting together the show was speaking with Dr. Jill Carter. And I asked what she thought about me working on this project about Aamjiwnaang with Vanessa and Beezy. And she said, well, your family's from Hong Kong. You're from a colonized place too. And I'd never even considered that. I think the colonial mindset that I was in, like, I feel like I was striving to be some sort of neutral theater creator, that was even something possible. And it was so ingrained in me in the type of training that I was doing that it was a really powerful moment. And that led to other realizations about, okay, well, what did Hong Kong experience when it was colonized by the British? What is the colonial legacy on my family in terms of why they even came to this country? What did a better life mean to them when they dreamt about what Canada was? And what was hidden from them? What was hidden from view in that dream of Canada, in the colonial, version of Canada that convinced them to come and did not get them engaged in these issues and actively, kept them separate from these issues. I don't know if that was so clear, but in terms of and I think those are important because I don't think that we can do this work. I don't think that we can be engaged authentically in climate work, especially in the context of Canada, if we are not asking where we are coming from, and if we are not looking at that whole tangle of what colonial histories look like from the places that we're coming from. Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
And you touched on a later question that I have, which is about the complexity of you taking the role of storyteller to tell the stories of your Indigenous friends and colleagues, of their protest against the destruction of the environment. And in a really lovely meta way, that actually becomes part of the storytelling of the piece itself. Your enlightenment as to how your subjectivity does not remove you from questions of colonization. Santee, can I ask you to respond to this question?
Sure.
How do you respond to this assertion that from an Indigenous and Indigenous studies perspective, climate change is simply intensified colonialism?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I would. I'll speak in terms of like referencing Skana, for example, the piece called Skana and Gayangeha means peace or balance, and it's a foundational concept within our way of understanding the world. But it also has to do about land. So I'm Mohawk. I'm from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and moved and displaced here from our traditional homelands historically in upper state New York. So just the fact that now Turtle Island has been divided into two colonial countries, my ancestry does not recognize that border. We also, the border was imposed in a colonial imposition on us. And so that's something that we deal with in Skana and the work that through this climate catastrophe that's happening, the characters would have made a journey from Six Nations and traveled back to our traditional homelands, which happens to be in what is now the United States. So it all has to do to our connection to land. And as you'll see across the country, there are many issues of land and treaties. And so that is very much a part of the concept within Skana. What are those foundational treaties that belong and have come from the land pre-colonization that we need to uphold? And that people, as Kevin is mentioning too, people, newcomers to Canada, new immigrants, even people who are Canadians, they are part of that. They are part of the treaty process. Simply living in this land, you are connected to some of those really grounding treaties that people don't really associate with or don't know about, that they actually are part of those original agreements. And all of those agreements had to do with equitable sharing of the land and resources. For example, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, foundational to how we live in relation to each other and live in relation to the land, is that you're not to take more than you from the dish that you can use. Always leave the dish full for someone else, and what you take, you replenish. And you don't take the spoon either. So in the work, in every work that I do, whether it's the mush hole, which is very clearly showing the colonial implications for Indigenous people, there are so many layers that are layered into the concepts and the research that happens within the community and specific knowledge keepers, and then with my collaborators, that we boil it down to an end product. But really, I could write PhDs about every production that we do. So, and I'm sure it's like that for everyone. But yeah, that's in terms of climate change. I mean, it's sort of that extractive commodification of the land is ongoing, and that's also what we're addressing in Skana, is that the world has become completely out of balance. And how do we, part of our process is how do we, even within our embodiment of our movement, restore balance and in a world that is completely out of balance? And that's been the driving questioning that we're having, and what's possible when we're on the edge of collapse.
It's listening to you talk about treaties in the context of this question made me think about the offer, the knowledge, the wisdom that that all beings are connected, and that human, non-human, and that we're all connected to the land. So treaties are the land is a treaty holder. Mm-hmm. Would that be correct to say that when the treaties are between peoples, are they also is the land an entity in a treaty?
For sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of our foundational addresses, which is really important for placing humans in context with the natural world, is that everything is a living entity. So when we give our Thanksgiving, we are acknowledging people, and then earth, water, and all the way up to the cosmos. And, that includes animals, that includes like every single living entity that humans are just within that one small aspect within that larger universe. And the idea that it forms is that everything is connected, everything is related, and that humans are to care for that. That's our big responsibility. So that we actually do have a responsibility to land, to the environment, and that is sort of very foundational to how to live in the world and how to actively be a human. So those it's about how you are embracing and putting actions forward to be a human being.
Thank you, Santee. So David, how do you respond to the argument that from Indigenous and Indigenous Studies perspectives, climate change has simply intensified colonialism? How do you resonate with that?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what Santee was talking about around notions of extractive forms of economic practices. I think it can be useful to understand the relationship between any form of exploitation and subjugation, the extraction of value, and to see it system-wide, be it the history of, a lot of really rich feminist philosophy and anthropology that shows the emergence of patriarchy happens when men start gathering and using women, trading women, using women simply for reproductive purposes, ownership structures of patriarchy, essentially, that is an extractive dynamic of value from one type of that class of persons, the patriarch, trying to extract value from women. And then you see that comparable level of extraction that Catherine Youssef talks about in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes, where she talks about the history of mining and extraction of value from the earth globally being largely done in the last 400 or 500 years by European colonial masters over brown bodies that had been captured and had value extracted and exploited from them. And that this process of value extraction from the earth then extends itself into Euro-American colonialism of the last 500-600 years as bodies, landscapes, spices, ore, golds, precious metals, these types of things are extracted for their value. And so this whole notion of value extraction, predicated on one group of persons having the power to extract value from other things and other people, again, the notion of supremacy, that really ties together a lot of the contemporary struggles for different forms of equity and justice, be it climate justice, racial justice, end of gender-based violence, ableist justice, and so on and so forth. And so I think understanding that structural logic that ties all of these things together, usually tied into an economic practice organized around systematized forms of greed, can be a really useful way of starting to build allyship across a whole series of different types of struggles. And then when we start to look at how theater and performance can play a role in taking apart, complexifying, critiquing, offering different visions of different futures based on perhaps rich pasts or unanticipated arrangements of connectivity and collaboration. I think that's where the very specific spark of creativity and critique that can happen in theater and performance across any number of different types of theater and performance traditions. I think that's where we can understand ourselves as interested in a particular set of art forms is beginning to respond or continuing to respond rather really actively to those structural forms of supremacy and extraction.
Thanks, David. And I have that leads me really neatly to a follow-on question for Kevin. I will please say, folks that are listening, if you've got any questions or comments, please pop them into your comment function and we will respond to them. But in hearing the conversation around extraction, and David, thank you for kind of teasing out all of the different forms that might take, that logic might take, can bring us to a very specific example of a situation of resource extraction and colonial exploitation of the land that, as I understand it, was the spark for you to make your show, Kevin. So can you talk about the Chemical Valley and what about it was so compelling to you to make a piece about it?
Totally. I think that what was immediately compelling was a confrontation with my own ignorance, and the fact that this one location so close to where I lived seemed to be such a microcosm of all of the conversation that was taking place across the country. And yet I felt that the people around me had been totally surprised when I even brought up this community in conversation. But how could that be when this industry had been there for 160 years? And I really thought there was something there in terms of why we weren't aware of this situation, why the government feels that this community is expendable in a way, in that they are. What is really upsetting, I'm sorry if I'm going all over the place, there's a plaque in Sarnia commemorating something called the Village of the Blue Water. And this is a settler community of workers that had a temporary housing situation across from one of the petrochemical factories. And the plaque commemorates the fact that they were moved because of health and safety reasons and because industry had to expand. Aamjiwnaang First Nation is still at the fence line of all of these factories. And I think when I talk to settlers about it, or I don't get enough time to speak deeply about it with settlers, it feels like, oh, these factories, how are they supposed to move? But the history is so shallow for these factories to have been there. 160 years since they found oil in the region of Sarnia versus thousands of years, time immemorial. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation has had this traditional territory. And so how is it possible that the context that we have is just economic? It's just about these factories that are here. It's not human. It doesn't humanize this this community at all. And I thought it was just so striking that Canada, so recently as the Vancouver Olympics, was using Indigenous leaders as like for show at an opening ceremony when there were boil water crises across the country. And it just felt so wrong, and I was shocked. And I felt very upset that I had no idea, and how is it possible that that even when folks were trying to do work on climate, that it was so abstract when such a dire situation was happening to our neighbors. Yeah, and so that's what brought me in initially. And of course, Vanessa and Beezy, being incredible land defenders, water protectors, and really putting their faces and voices out there so that I could even hear about this topic in the first place. And carrying the torch from other folks that had been there beforehand, also raising awareness on the issue.
When I was picturing the Chemical Valley through your evocation of it in the show, it put me in mind of the super big budget, I don't know if it was Netflix or HBO, the Chernobyl, which a lot of people were watching during, and I actually couldn't get through the first two, I watched the first two episodes and I'm like, we all know where this is going. But and it was, huge budget and, very much, reveling in the bad fashion and, or dated fashion. But I was thinking about how stories engage us with climate destruction, and be they big popular, big budget multinational shows, TV shows, or small scale theater productions. that it's allowing people to get to know a specific story. And then the way that you spread that story all the way, you follow the pipeline past your favorite bubble tea store, that it's saying it affected you in Scarborough as a kid too, whether or not you knew it.
Could I speak to that?
Yeah.
I mean,
sure.
One of the things that I find interesting about, climate disaster porn, you might call it that, is that there's a lot of kind of revelatory nihilism as a initial sort of human response, either in speculative fiction like sci-fi, or think of all the movies that we've grown up on where things come from outer space and destroy the planet, or there's massive tides of water. There's something that I think engages a certain part of the human spirit around going, oh my God, it's a disaster. And that's a useful, I guess, form of exploration. But I think it's a little harder then to find narrative stories that don't just sort of rest, perhaps, tarry in that kind of space of nihilism, right? Because we think about the kinds of work that it's going to take to turn around this sixth mass extinction event. I was part of a panel the other day with a marine climatologist and biologist, and she was, pointing out that the last time that there was this many parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere were 10 million years ago. And we're at 403 parts per million, and by the end of the 21st century, it's going to be 1,200, and there will have never been that much kind of gases in the air. I mean, there really is an awful lot of work to be done, and so I'm always a little hesitant about, the work of the sort of the nihilist capitalist indulgence that can take a climate crisis and turn that into a product, sell it back to people who can go, oh my God, I can only watch 2 episodes because this is going to be a disaster. There's a nihilism in there, right? There is a sort of a dramatic irony of knowing that everything's going to crap. So, I mean, I find myself much more interested in the more difficult work of, I don't want to say naive or unnecessarily optimistic, but the hopeful work of trying to find responses that can generate human and other than human solidarities based on our collective experience, based on different thought traditions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I really want to throw this question over to you, Santee, but just to respond to you, David, I mean, I think the instinct to turn off was a rejection of the disaster porn aspect of that show. Like that, it's like, why are we here? What I don't see what's going to be gained by telling this story. I mean, maybe we'll get some historical detail, but how visceral and evocative it was is that really what we need to be doing right now with our energies and our imaginations? So, Santee, can I ask you to talk specifically about story, because that's come up in terms of Kevin telling a story, wanting to tell a story that people can connect to about this perhaps abstract and overwhelming concept of climate change. How do you connect to the idea of story as a creator yourself?
Well, the story is really paramount in all of my works, and that's sort of the drive to share the story, and I happen to do that in a very embodied way. So dance being the sort of the main, but there's other things that come in to help drive the story. And when we're creating in our creation process, it's always about like how do things come in, whether it's design elements or the development of the characters that push the story forward. And I think that through the work that I do, and in all my productions are different, that I'm sharing a story that it's not necessarily has been in sort of the mainstream storytelling in theaters and film, and sort of underrepresented stories. And I think from Kaha perspective, or collaborating with other Indigenous peoples' stories. So for me, that's a really big part of my purpose as an artist, is to amplify underrepresented stories, or stories from the land, stories that have not been given voice. So it is that part of giving voice to different ideas. And for works like Skana, there are many stories within a story within a story. It's because we're able to do that. So even though the work is about set in this future, and it falls in line with that sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian kind of thing that's happening, but it really is not. It's about the stories of these individuals dealing with what's happening at that time, so many things factor into this story. We've got the story of this displaced climate sort of refugees from Gayangahaga trying to go and restore themselves. But then we have other characters. We have elder woman from Mexico who joins. We have a East Coast African descent person coming in. We have a white stock market person whose life just collapsed coming and joining. And so it's quite fun actually to put these stories all together and see how people would be dealing with life if that was, if collapse was in the process of happening, and how do they come together? How would you rebuild? One thing that I wanted to share is that within a lot of Indigenous, and we have it within our nation as well, as we have prophecies of potential, like prophesized stories that were not really, I guess they're stories as well, that this is going to happen. Like there's, going to be some destruction in the way that things are going. And but I always ask, because I hear the prophecies, and then I ask, what if people were sharing the prophecies, what were they sharing solutions? So it's sort of like, how do we what are the solutions? What are the actions? What are people doing? And so that is, I guess, an individual question that everybody needs to take, and even realize that, everybody is making an impact, and what can we do individually, but then as a society. So, and that's where the work is, and there's no easy solutions necessarily. So part of SCANA is they're trying to find the solutions to reestablish or rebuild in the midst of everything falling apart, to go back to those original understandings of how to live in balance.
Thank you, Santee.
Answering any questions.
Absolutely, totally. I just want to read out a couple of comments from Marianne Manachem Vangbudi, who is a first-year student in our department, who writes about, here we go, about Kevin's show, being someone who also came from another country to find a better life and got the great opportunity to see the Chemical Valley Project made me ever more aware of what's happening around us in Canada. Thank you for sharing that with us. It means a lot and is very important to hear. So that's lovely. And Kevin, you'll get a chance to meet Marianne because she's a student in the class that you're coming to visit on Wednesday.
I can't wait. Thank
you so much.
So
thank you so much, Marianne, for that comment. That was awesome. In the time that remains, I just am thinking, when we're talking about stories and storytelling and ancient stories and new stories and future stories, about the stories that, what are we going to tell, or what are folks going to tell in the future about this time, and this unprecedented predicament that we find ourselves in, and what stories are they going to tell about how we told stories through theater during this time. And so, Kevin, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience of flipping Chemical Valley into a digital experience, because it was a live show and now it's a digital show. So how did that go?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I also really just want to respond to, it was really inspired, Santee, hearing you speak about connection and collapse, and maybe that does relate to the digital thing, because we're trying to connect in this moment of collapse of our industry. And I think I'm just thinking about that word collapse a lot right now, in terms of we're not at, I think the idea of collapse is also abstract. David, when you talk about like the apocalyptic, like when is that moment? Isn't it now? Are we okay with the wildfires that are taking place all over the world? Is now the moment? Like when do we draw the line and say we've reached that moment? So when we think about when people are talking about our time in the future, is that even 5 years from now? Is it 5 years from now when we look back and we said that IPCC report came out 2 years ago and said that we had 11 years and we're over halfway there? What did we do? We still haven't done anything. Is it going to be 10 years when we said it's 2030? We haven't reduced our emissions by 45%. What's going to happen now? For me, it's interesting that it's an abstract line, I guess, that it always changes for me. But I think that 10 years is quite helpful now, thinking about 2030. On the digital pivot, it was really interesting. We were so well supported. Our team was really incredible in being so enthusiastic about trying to figure out what the best way to do this was. The team at FOPAC was so great in helping us figure out what the adaptation to digital also could look like, both to do it safely in a space and to get the best possible experience for our audience. I'll say as a performer, it was a fascinating experience viewing the work back. And I would say the link is still up if people are curious. Between performance 1 and performance 2, I even had a different attack on the performance, I would say, in that I think theatrical delivery comes across as maybe a little bit too earnest. I don't know what the audience thinks about this, but I do think Friday was an earnestness that I believe works in the theater and an urgency that works in the theater. But when the audience is here and a mic right here, that there's something about like the way that sound is compressed on a mic where if you just bring it down a little bit, I found myself coming into the screen a bit more. And I think it was really an experiment in so many different variables. And I would say it's a step 1 for us in terms of figuring out where we're going. And our larger hope is, can we find ways of continuing to explore what it means to be sharing this digital space, what it means to be honoring an audience that is sharing digital space, and some things we didn't want to lose. For example, the top of the show, we always say it's a relaxed production. We didn't use that language this time, but we made sure to emphasize that whatever people needed to do to be comfortable, they should absolutely do that, for example. So yeah, compromises. Maybe my one-word answer would be compromises. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, but also learning, it sounds like, Kevin, is so interesting. And again, I look forward to talking about this when you come to visit my class on Wednesday about that you actually actively altered your delivery because of what you learned about the show. And I mean, I think there's also a lot of implications around this, around theater training and pedagogy, like right now, as David and I know, and anybody knows who's navigating a teaching space right now. It's not just changing how we teach through these media, but it's also like, what do we teach? So should you had to alter your delivery, Kevin, to find a space that was between screen and stage? And I know that I wonder, David, if you could just speak a little bit about the challenges and rewards you recently faced in putting on a entire show featuring our undergraduate students through the medium of Zoom.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll just tie that back into the question about story and what stories of the era might look like in the future. I mean, something that I think we were conscious of as we had in our recent dramatic arts departmental production of like 14 distributed performance spaces, one in Mexico, one in Thorold, a couple in St. Catharines, and many of them distributed in small spaces around the building. We were really clear that part of the story was written by COVID itself, that other than human entities have the ability to write the story. And in fact, that very much impacted the narrative of how we undertook that exploration. And so one of the things that we might look back upon or think about now about how to tell stories is to recognize that the other than human needs to be a co-collaborator as we look at stories around environmental justice, climate justice, environmental restoration, and unpack, the anthropocentric pleasures of telling stories about humans' interactions with one another, with nature, quote unquote, as a backdrop. Because COVID made itself so much part of the narrative, and the climate crisis is a way in which the planet's ecosystems are saying, wake up, we are telling the story now, not just you. you need to co-create with us. So I think part of our work is about learning how to embrace that.
Can I say one thing about story too after that, is that definitely sight and is part of our story. It's another character in our story. Even when we were working at the Mohawk Institute, the building and the grounds were characters within the story, and it was really important to embrace that. And so with the work that we do, land-based creation, it is it's really trying to open to have land be a part of sharing the story and through us. So land being the main collaborator. So that's really important in the storytelling as well. And how to open yourself up to let that happen as artists, and which might seem, sort of like, I guess it's really, and the time that it takes to really open yourself up to connect with land. How do you do that? And so for a lot of the creation process, we've been in land, in water, and that is a really important part of creating and sharing the stories in relation to land, and land being a part of the story as well.
Thanks, Santee. And thinking back on watching the Mush Hole, that place is so evoked in the fabric of the work, not just because of projections in the set, but there's I felt like I could feel as a spectator that the place through the performance, that it's not just a place, it's a history, it's a set of experiences, it's all that pain and memory. So it's really exciting to be looking forward to seeing the new work that you're making and its connection to its place. I also want to say that Mother Nature just really blessed you, Santee, because there was just this beam of light that came through your house right before you spoke. So we're coming right up to the end, and we have a bit of a heart out because there's another event at 2, which I highly recommend that folks tune into, which is the second batch of showings of commissions that we made in the Department of Dramatic Arts at Brock to local artists and educators, a number of whom are graduates of our department, around the theme of climate change. And so they're beta tests, experiments, offerings, and 2 of them are coming up in, by my clock, 2 minutes time. So I would just really like to thank these 3 lovely panelists for engaging in these questions and with each other. And Kelly Wolf says in comments, and that's absolutely, Kelly offered some of her work in the first of these showings on Friday night, and absolutely her work with algae in Lake Erie and a beautiful costume and figure that comes out of the changing environment of the lake, absolutely resonates for me too, Kelly. So thank you all very much. Thanks
everybody.
Thanks for participating. Be well. Take care. See you on Wednesday, Kevin. Bye. Zoom wave. Bye.